The auditorium buzzed with noise that evening. It wasn't a grand concert hall, but for the small town it was their biggest night of the year, the annual community talent show. Rows of chairs filled up quickly, and the faint sound of laughter and conversation echoed off the wooden walls. People had come to see singers, dancers, comedians, and a few brave souls who would dare to play an instrument. Near the corner of the stage, a young woman sat quietly, waiting for her turn. Her name was Lila. She wore a simple white blouse and dark pants, nothing fancy, and her hair was tied back neatly. She looked calm, almost invisible among the lively crowd backstage, but inside her heart beat fast. She hadn't played in front of an audience for a long time. Tonight she wasn't here to prove anything. She just wanted to play. On stage, a group of teenagers finished their dance routine. The audience clapped politely, and the host stepped up to the microphone, smiling wide. "All right, next we have Lila performing a piano piece." Her name barely echoed before a few whispers rose from the back row. "Piano?" someone muttered. "Didn't know we had a pianist in town." Another man, sitting with a few friends near the center, laughed quietly. He was known around town for his loud opinions and his habit of criticizing everyone else's performances. He leaned back in his chair and said, just loud enough for others to hear, "Let's see if she even knows which keys to press." His friends chuckled. Lila heard the laughter. She always did, but she didn't look up. She walked slowly toward the stage, her small steps tapping against the wooden floor. The host smiled kindly and whispered, "You got this," before handing her the microphone. She didn't take it. She simply gave a small nod, sat down at the piano and placed her fingers on the keys. The hall fell silent for a moment. The lights dimmed slightly. From the front, she could see rows of expectant faces, some smiling, some distracted, some already judging. But Lila didn't look at anyone. Her eyes stayed on the piano. Her fingers trembled slightly. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper, the memory of everything that had brought her here. A year ago, Lila wouldn't have dared to perform again. There was a time when music had been her whole life. As a child, she had learned to play by listening to her grandmother's old records. She could spend hours at the piano, losing herself in the sound. People used to call her gifted, a natural. But things had changed when she grew older. Life got heavier. Bills, work, and long nights took away her time for music. And after a small accident that injured her wrist, she thought her days of performing were over. For months, the piano in her living room sat covered with dust. Sometimes when she walked past it, she would stop, touch the edge of the keys, and walk away. It hurt to look at it. It reminded her of what she had lost. Then one evening, while helping her neighbor's son with his school project, she heard a piece of music playing on the radio, a piano melody that made her stop in her tracks. It was simple, gentle, but full of emotion. That sound woke something in her heart she had buried for too long. That night she uncovered the piano and tried to play again. The first few notes were rough, her fingers stiff and slow. But she kept going. Day after day her touch returned. Slowly she began to remember what music had always meant to her. Not perfection, not fame, but peace. And now, sitting under the lights in that crowded hall, Lila closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She could still hear the man's laughter in the back. She could feel the weight of every stare on her shoulders, but none of it mattered anymore. Her right hand moved first, pressing down a single key. A soft, deep note filled the room. Just one sound, but it hung in the air like a whisper that carried something unexplainable. The laughter stopped. Even the restless children in the front row went still. It was as if that one note had spoken a language everyone understood, a feeling that reached straight to the heart. She waited a moment, letting the sound fade, then began to play. Slowly at first, the notes falling like raindrops. Her left hand joined, adding depth, warmth, and rhythm. The melody was gentle but powerful. It wasn't a flashy song, not something meant to impress. It was honest. Every key she touched seemed to hold a memory of her struggles, her pain, her quiet hope. The audience leaned forward. Some recognized the tune, others didn't. But all of them felt it. The man who had laughed earlier straightened in his seat. His smirk faded as he watched her hands move with effortless grace. Lila didn't look up. She didn't need to. She wasn't playing for them. She was playing from herself. The sound filled the hall like a story with no words. She remembered the first time her grandmother had told her, Music is what the heart says when words can't. That memory warmed her as she played. The audience could almost feel that warmth too. A few children in the front row looked mesmerized. One little girl whispered to her mother, "She's making the piano talk." Her mother nodded silently, eyes fixed on the stage. For Lila, every note carried the years she thought she'd lost. The times she felt small. The night she sat alone staring at the piano she couldn't bring herself to play. And now here she was, not perfect, not trying to impress anyone, just finally free. As the melody grew, the sound became stronger, fuller. People exchanged glances. This wasn't what they had expected from a quiet woman in a plain blouse. There was power in her music, but not the kind that demanded attention. It was the kind that drew you in gently and refused to let you go. Even the man who had laughed found himself leaning forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on her hands. He couldn't explain it, but something about the way she played made his chest tighten. When Lila reached the middle of her piece, her hands flowed effortlessly, the melody rising like a soft wave. The entire hall felt lighter, almost sacred. Every sound, every breath, seemed to move in rhythm with her music. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, she slowed down again. Her fingers hovered above the keys. A faint smile crossed her face. She pressed one last note, in the same note that had started it all, and let it linger. The sound faded slowly into silence. No one moved. For a few seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then someone began to clap. Another followed. And then the entire hall rose to its feet in applause. Lila looked up for the first time. The lights reflected in her eyes as she smiled softly and stood. She gave a small bow, her hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from relief. She had done it. The man in the middle row stayed seated for a moment, staring at her. His friends whispered something, but he didn't hear them. He could still feel that first note echoing in his mind. He didn't know why it had moved him so deeply. Maybe because it reminded him of something real, something he had forgotten to feel. When he finally stood to clap, he did it with genuine respect. Backstage, as Lila walked off the stage, a few people came up to her. "That was beautiful," someone said. Another added, "You made me cry." Lila smiled politely, thanked them, and quietly moved toward the back door. She didn't need the attention. She didn't need the praise. For her, the real victory was that she had played again, honestly, fearlessly, from the heart. Outside, the night was calm. She could still hear faint applause echoing behind her as she stepped into the cool air. The stars were out and she smiled softly, whispering to herself. One note was enough. She walked home that night with peace in her heart. Her story wasn't about being the best or proving anyone wrong. It was about rediscovering herself through music. And for everyone who had been in that hall, her performance would become a story they'd never forget. A quiet reminder that sometimes, even the smallest sound can carry the deepest truth. The next morning, the sun peeked through Lila's window, and the soft light spilled across the small living room. Her piano sat quietly in the corner, the same way it always did, but it somehow looked different now. Last night had changed something inside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel nervous looking at those keys. She smiled faintly and traced her fingers along the edge of the instrument. There was still a faint echo of the applause from the night before in her mind. It hadn't been about the clapping or the praise. It was about finally finding her courage again. She had faced her fear, and for a few minutes she had felt free. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message appeared from the event organizer, thanking her for performing. They said the crowd couldn't stop talking about her piece, that her name had been the most mentioned one that night. She sat down on the couch, reading it twice before setting her phone aside. Lila didn't want attention. She didn't even plan to perform again. For her, the show had been closure, a promise she made to herself to play just once more. But life has a way of surprising people when they least expect it. That afternoon, while she was at the small cafe down the street, a man approached her table. He looked familiar, neatly dressed, kind eyes, a bit older than her. He smiled politely and said, "Excuse me, you're the woman who played at the hall last night, right?" Lila nodded, a little unsure. "Yes, that was me. I'm glad I found you," he said. "I was in the audience. I run the music program at the community center. We teach kids after school. I wanted to ask if you'd consider giving a small session. Maybe just a short class for the students. They were really inspired by you. Lila blinked, surprised. Me teach? He nodded eagerly. They saw you perform. A few of them even asked if you'd come. You don't have to say yes now, but think about it. He left his card on the table and smiled before walking away. Lila stared at the card for a long moment. She hadn't thought about teaching. The idea felt strange. She wasn't a professional pianist anymore, but the thought of helping children discover music tugged gently at her heart. That night, she sat at her piano again. She played softly, not a performance this time, just the quiet sound of her thoughts. Each note seemed to guide her somewhere new. By morning, she had made up her mind. She called the man back and agreed to visit the center that week. When she arrived, the community center was full of energy. The walls were covered with drawings, music sheets, and posters from local events. The small classroom where she'd be teaching had an old upright piano, a little out of tune, but it had charm. A handful of kids sat waiting, curious and excited. Most of them were between 10 and 12 years old. Some had never touched a piano before. Their bright eyes followed her as she walked in. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm not really a teacher, but I can show you what music means to me." The children smiled and the class began. Lila showed them how to find middle C, how to press the keys gently, how to listen to the sound before moving on to the next. But more than technique, she talked about feeling, how every note could say something words couldn't. At first, the kids giggled and made mistakes, but slowly, they began to listen. They began to feel, and that's when Lila saw it, the same spark she once had when she was their age. Weeks passed, and those short sessions became the best part of her week. The children adored her, and she in return found joy in their progress. There was one boy in particular, quiet, reserved, always sitting in the corner. He didn't speak much, but listened closely. Every time Lila played, his eyes would light up. One day after class, he stayed behind. He hesitated before speaking, his voice soft. "Miss, do you think anyone can really learn to play? Even if they're not special?" Lila looked at him and smiled warmly. "Music isn't about being special," she said. "It's about being honest. If you play with honesty, the piano will listen to you." He nodded slowly as if her words meant more than she realized. That evening, as she walked home, she couldn't stop thinking about that boy's question. It reminded her of herself years ago, full of doubt, unsure if she was good enough. She realized something important then. Maybe this was what she was meant to do, not perform for applause, but to help others find their voice through music. But life had one more surprise waiting for her. One afternoon, as she finished her class, a man stood near the door. It took her a moment to recognize him, the same man who had laughed during her performance at the hall. He looked uncomfortable, his hands in his pockets. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked quietly. The room emptied as the kids ran out, leaving just the two of them. Lila stayed by the piano, unsure what to expect. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for that night. I laughed at you. I thought you were just another amateur trying to show off. But then you played and—" He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "That one note, it hit me hard. I don't know how to explain it." Lila didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, sensing he meant every word. "I used to play," he continued, "years ago, before I gave up on it. Hearing you made me realize how much I missed it. I felt ashamed." Lila smiled gently. "It's never too late to start again," she said. He looked up, surprised. "You really think so?" She nodded. "Music doesn't leave us. Sometimes we just stop listening for a while." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're wiser than you look." They talked for a few minutes more, and before leaving, he asked if she would help him start playing again. Lila agreed. It felt right. To help someone find what they had lost, just as she once had. The next few weeks turned into something unexpected. She began giving him lessons, and slowly, the awkwardness between them turned into friendship. He practiced diligently, always grateful, always humble. Sometimes they would both sit at the piano, sharing stories about their lives and how music had shaped them. It wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. The children noticed, too. During class, Lila would often tell them, "The piano is a mirror. It plays what your heart feels." The kids loved that line, repeating it every time they struggled with a tune. One evening, the community center decided to hold a small recital, just a casual event for families to see what the kids had learned. Lila was asked to open the show again. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. When the night came, the room was packed. Parents filled every chair, cameras ready. The same man, her new friend and former critic, sat in the front row cheering for the students. As Lila stepped to the piano, she looked around the room. There were no whispers, no laughter this time, just quiet expectation and warm smiles. She pressed one note. The same soft sound that had once silenced a crowd now filled the room with comfort. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was a conversation, a thank you, a prayer. The audience didn't just hear her music. They felt her story. And as the melody flowed, Lila realized how far she had come. When she finished, the applause was loud but gentle, full of love, not surprise. The children hugged her, the parents thanked her, and the man who had once mocked her said quietly, "You didn't just play the piano tonight. You reminded us all what it means to feel." That night, as she walked home, the streets quiet under the glow of the lamps, she thought about how everything had changed because of one small act. The courage to play again. Sometimes, the world doesn't need noise or fame to be moved. Sometimes all it takes is one note, played with truth, to open hearts that have been silent for too long. And from that night on, Lila knew that her journey with music was far from over. She had found her place, her peace, and most importantly, her purpose. Days turned into weeks, and the soft rhythm of Lila's new life began to settle. Each morning, she would wake up early, make a cup of tea, and sit by her piano before heading to the community center. The sound of her own playing had become like breathing, something that gave her calm before the world fully woke up. Her classes at the center were always full of laughter now. The children didn't just come to learn music. They came to feel happy. They talked, they shared stories, and they treated the piano as something magical, a friend that always listened. One morning when she arrived, the boy who always sat in the corner, the quiet one who had asked her if anyone could really learn to play, was already waiting outside the door. He held a small notebook filled with scribbles of notes and music symbols. "I tried to write my own song," he said shyly, "but I don't know if it makes sense." Lila smiled and motioned for him to sit at the piano. "Let's hear it." He began to play, awkwardly, his timing uneven, his hands unsure. But there was something in it, something pure. The melody was simple but filled with feeling. When he finished, he looked up, nervous. "Was it bad?" "No," Lila said softly. "It was honest. And that's what matters." He smiled, his shoulders relaxing. It was the first time she had seen him truly believe in himself. That small spark of confidence reminded her of her own journey, how one note, one act of courage had changed her entire life. As months passed, more children joined her classes. The program grew so quickly that the community center decided to hold another recital, this time bigger and open to nearby towns. The organizers asked Lila to be the coordinator. She hesitated. It was a lot of work. But something inside her told her to say yes. Soon her days were filled with planning, rehearsals, and helping students pick their songs. Some wanted to play classical pieces, others wrote their own. She guided each one patiently, knowing that music wasn't about showing off. It was about expression. Word about her program began to spread. One afternoon, while she was setting up chairs in the hall, a woman from a nearby city visited. She introduced herself as a music columnist for a local paper. "I've been hearing about this small-town piano teacher who changes the way children see music," she said with a warm smile. "Would you let me sit in on one of your sessions?" Lila was surprised but agreed. The journalist sat quietly in a corner during class, watching the children play, laugh, and learn. Afterward, she approached Lila and said, "This is special. What you're doing here isn't just about piano lessons. It's about healing. You bring heart into something that's often treated like competition." Lila smiled politely, unsure how to respond. She had never thought of it that way. A week later, an article appeared in the newspaper. The headline read, "The Woman Who Teaches Music from the Heart." It described her story, how she once stopped playing, how she found her courage again, and how she now inspired children to find their own voices. She didn't expect much from it, but soon after, people began calling the center. Parents wanted to enroll their kids, adults wanted to learn, and a few even offered to donate instruments. What started as a small class became a growing movement in their little town. The man she had once taught, the same one who had laughed at her, became her assistant at the center. He helped tune the pianos, organize events, and sometimes even played alongside her. Their friendship grew quietly, built on shared respect and second chances. One evening, after a long day of lessons, they sat together in the empty hall. The lights were low and the piano gleamed softly in the glow. "You ever think about how different things would be if you hadn't played that night?" he asked. Lila smiled. "Sometimes. But maybe it was supposed to happen that way. Maybe we all need a moment that wakes us up." He nodded thoughtfully. "You woke up more than just yourself?" Her eyes softened. She looked around at the quiet room that had once been filled with doubt, but was now full of laughter and life. "Music has a way of finding where it belongs," she said. As their program continued to grow, the town council decided to honor Lila's work. They invited her to speak at the cultural festival that summer. The theme was Voices That Inspire. When she received the invitation, she felt nervous again. Public speaking wasn't her strength. She preferred to let her piano speak for her. But everyone at the center encouraged her to go. The day of the festival arrived under a bright, cloudless sky. The stage was set in the town square, decorated with flowers and banners. Families gathered, children ran around, and music filled the air. When her turn came, she walked slowly to the stage. A large piano waited for her at the center. She looked out at the crowd, familiar faces, parents, students, and even strangers who had read about her story. She didn't give a long speech. She simply said, "When I first sat at a piano again, I was scared. I thought I had lost my chance. But that one note I played that night reminded me that music doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for honesty. And that's something we all have inside us." She turned toward the piano and played a short piece, the same melody she had played at the talent show, but gentler, filled with warmth. The crowd fell silent, completely drawn in. Some people closed their eyes, others held hands. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But among all the clapping, what touched her most was seeing her students standing near the stage, cheering for her, their faces glowing with pride. After the festival, more opportunities opened up. Nearby schools invited her to hold workshops. She was even asked to perform at a small music conference in the city. It was overwhelming at times, but she stayed humble, always remembering where she started. Through it all, she never forgot the importance of that one moment. The moment she chose to play again despite the laughter, the doubt, the fear. That choice had changed everything. Months later, something unexpected happened. The quiet boy who had written his own little melody came running into class one morning, holding a letter in his hand. "I got accepted into the regional youth orchestra," he shouted, his face glowing with excitement. The whole class cheered, and Lila felt her heart swell with pride. The boy hugged her tightly. "You told me anyone can play if they're honest." "You were right." Lila's eyes shimmered. She didn't say much, just smiled and whispered, "I'm proud of you." That moment reminded her once again why she kept teaching. It wasn't about creating perfect musicians. It was about helping people believe in themselves again, the same way she had learned to believe in herself. Later that week, she received a letter from a music foundation in the city. They had read about her story and wanted to support her center by donating a new grand piano. When the instrument finally arrived, everyone gathered to see it unveiled. It gleamed under the light, beautiful, polished, and full of promise. Lila ran her hand across the keys, tears filling her eyes. She turned to her students and said softly, "This piano belongs to all of us. Every note we play from it should carry kindness." The children clapped and crowded around, their faces glowing with joy. That evening, as she played the new piano for the first time, she felt the same peace she had felt on that stage months ago. Calm, whole, and grateful. Her journey had started with mockery, but it had led to meaning. Music had given her more than she could have imagined: friends, purpose, and a way to touch lives quietly. That night, before going to bed, she sat by the window with a notebook in her lap. She began to write a simple line. It all started with one note. She smiled to herself and closed the book. Outside, the world was calm. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear laughter, the sound of her students leaving the center after practice. And in that gentle noise, she found the sweetest melody of all. The soft morning light filtered through the windows of the community center, bouncing off the surface of the new grand piano. The children had just arrived, their voices echoing in excitement. Lila stood by the piano watching them run around, their laughter filling the air. That sound had become her favorite part of every day. The new piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a symbol, a reminder of how far things had come. Months ago, this hall had been quiet, almost forgotten. Now it was alive. As the children settled into their seats, Lila began the class with her usual warm smile. "Remember," she said, "the piano doesn't need perfect hands. It needs a true heart." The students nodded eagerly, repeating her words like a promise. That day, a small group from a neighboring town had come to visit. Their teacher had heard about Lila's program and wanted her students to experience something different. Among the visitors was a young girl who carried herself quietly, her eyes downcast. She sat at the back of the class and barely spoke. During the break, while the other children were laughing and practicing, Lila noticed the girl sitting alone. She walked over gently and asked, "You don't want to try?" The girl shook her head. "I'm not good. My teacher says I don't have a feel for it." Lila sat beside her and said softly, "Maybe he's wrong. Maybe you just haven't found the right sound yet." The girl looked at her unsure. "Here," Lila said, placing her fingers on the keys. She pressed one soft note, a low, calm sound that echoed warmly. "That's what it feels like when you don't try to impress anyone. Just listen." The girl hesitated, then slowly pressed another note. Her touch was uncertain at first, but when the sound came, her eyes widened a little. "That's it," Lila whispered. "That's your sound." By the end of the session, the girl was smiling. Before she left, she hugged Lila and said quietly, "I didn't know I could make something beautiful." That night, as Lila locked up the center, she thought about that moment. It was such a small thing. One note, one smile, but it reminded her why she kept doing what she did. Music had the power to heal what words couldn't reach. The next few weeks brought new surprises. A producer from a local TV channel called, saying they wanted to do a small feature on her program. "People love hearing stories like yours," the woman on the phone said. "It's real. It's hopeful." Lila hesitated. She didn't like the idea of cameras and lights. She didn't do this for attention. But after some encouragement from her students and her assistant, she agreed. The day of filming arrived quietly. The crew came with cameras and microphones, but they were kind and respectful. They filmed her teaching, the children laughing, and the piano keys moving under small hands. They asked her a few simple questions: why she started, what music meant to her, and what she hoped the children would learn. Lila answered with honesty. "Music saved me," she said softly. "It gave me a reason to keep going when I thought I had nothing left. I just want these kids to feel that too, to know that even when life is hard, there's always something beautiful waiting to be found." When the segment aired a week later, it spread faster than anyone expected. People from other towns began calling, asking if they could join or visit. Messages poured in from strangers, parents, teachers, even musicians, thanking her for reminding them what real music was about. She didn't expect any of it. She didn't even watch her own interview until one of her students insisted. When she finally did, she sat quietly, her eyes glistening. She realized that sometimes doing something small with love could ripple farther than you ever imagined. Soon, an invitation arrived from the city's cultural foundation. They were hosting a charity concert and wanted Lila and her students to perform. The event would raise funds for underprivileged children who wanted to learn music. It was the biggest opportunity she had ever received. But with it came pressure. The children were excited but nervous. Many of them had never played outside their town before. Lila could feel the tension in every practice session. Small mistakes, shaky hands, anxious faces. One evening, after everyone had left, she sat alone at the piano. The hall was dark except for a single lamp near the stage. Her fingers brushed across the keys as she played a soft tune. It was the same melody she had played that night long ago, the one that had silenced the crowd. Her assistant walked in quietly and sat beside her. "You're worried," he said gently. She nodded. "They're so young. I don't want them to feel what I once felt, the fear, the judgment." He smiled. "But that's the thing. You're not giving them fear. You're giving them courage." She looked at him thoughtful. He continued, "You didn't play that night to prove something. You played because you needed to. That's what you should tell them. Play because they need to, not because someone's watching." His words stayed with her. The next day, when the students gathered for rehearsal, She called everyone together. "Listen," she said, standing in front of the piano. "We're not going to the city to perform for applause. We're going to share what we love. Close your eyes. Think of why you started playing. Think of who you were when you first touched a key. That's the person you should bring to the stage." The room went quiet. Some of the children smiled softly. Others nodded with understanding. When the day of the concert finally came, the city hall was filled with people. The stage lights shone brightly and the air was thick with excitement. Lila stood backstage, her heart beating fast as she watched her students line up in their neat uniforms. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Remember, one note at a time." As the curtain rose, the children took their places. The first soft notes floated into the air, delicate but sure. The audience went still. The music wasn't perfect, a few small mistakes here and there, but it was real, heartfelt, and full of warmth. Lila watched from the side, her eyes misty. She could see how far they had come, not just as musicians, but as people who believed in themselves. When the performance ended, the crowd stood in applause. Cameras flashed, people cheered, and the children bowed proudly. Lila joined them on stage, her hands trembling slightly. A woman from the foundation stepped forward and handed her a small plaque. "For touching hearts through music," it read. Lila smiled humbly and whispered, "Thank you." That night after the concert, the group returned home, tired but glowing with happiness. On the bus ride back, the children sang softly, tapping their hands on the seats in rhythm. Lila looked out the window, watching the lights pass by, feeling a quiet peace she hadn't known in years. When they reached the center, she stayed behind for a moment while everyone else left. She sat at the piano once more and pressed a single key, just one, the same note that had changed everything. It rang through the empty hall, soft and steady. She smiled and whispered to herself, "It all began with this." What she didn't know was that somewhere across the city, a family watching the concert on TV had been deeply moved by her student's performance. The next morning, the same family reached out to the foundation, offering to fund new instruments for her program. A week later, when the delivery truck pulled up outside the center, the children screamed with joy. There were violins, guitars, flutes, more instruments than they had ever seen. Lila stood at the doorway, covering her mouth in disbelief. Her assistant laughed softly beside her. "Looks like your music keeps traveling farther." Lila turned to him with tears in her eyes and said quietly, "I guess kindness makes its own sound." That night, as the children played their new instruments, the sound filled the air, not just piano this time, but a whole chorus of laughter and music. And as Lila listened, she realized something beautiful. What began as a single moment, a woman sitting at a piano while someone laughed, had become something much bigger. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever doubted themselves, everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, everyone who just needed one note to find their strength again. And with that thought, she smiled, pressing one more key, soft, gentle, and full of hope. The sound of laughter and music filled the small community center every afternoon now. It had been months since the charity concert, and everything felt different. The dusty old hall that once sat empty was now alive with music. Children ran in carrying books, humming songs, or dragging their little keyboards behind them. The piano that had once stood alone at the front was now surrounded by new instruments, a gift from kind strangers who had seen Lila's story. Every day, she walked in with the same calm smile, greeted by eager faces waiting to learn something new. It wasn't just about piano lessons anymore. She had started small music circles, children learning to write songs, some practicing chords on guitars, others learning rhythm on drums. The entire place had turned into a space full of hope. What amazed Lila the most wasn't how fast the children learned, but how deeply they felt. Many of them came from homes where life wasn't easy, places where dreams were often set aside for survival. Yet when they played, their faces glowed with joy. Music gave them something to hold on to. One afternoon, while packing up after class, Lila received a letter. It was handwritten in a neat, careful style. Inside was a small note that read, "I saw your students play at the concert. I used to play piano years ago but stopped after my father passed. Watching them reminded me of why I started. I just wanted to thank you for bringing that feeling back." At the bottom was a name, Daniel, a pianist who used to perform in big halls but had retired early after losing his passion. Lila smiled and folded the letter. She had received many messages since that night, but something about this one touched her deeply, maybe because she understood what it meant to lose and then find yourself again through music. A few days later, she got another message, this time from a local radio host who wanted to invite her and her students for a live session. The idea was simple. The children would perform a few short pieces and talk about how the music program had changed their lives. Lila hesitated at first. She didn't want to overwhelm the children, but they were so excited that she finally agreed. When they arrived at the station, the children's eyes widened at the equipment, microphones, bright lights, and a large piano waiting in the center. The host welcomed them warmly, asking questions with genuine curiosity. The kids spoke about their journeys, how they were scared at first, how they practiced even when it was hard, and how Lila never stopped believing in them. Then they played a short piece together. It wasn't perfect. One of the younger kids missed a few notes, another came in early. But it was real. The sound carried warmth that couldn't be edited or rehearsed. When the song ended, even the staff clapped quietly, moved by the honesty in those few minutes. After the broadcast, something unexpected happened. The recording of that session went viral online. Thousands of people shared it, commenting about how refreshing it was to see genuine emotion in music again. The story spread far beyond their small town. Within a week, Lila started getting invitations from schools, events, and even music festivals asking her to bring her students to perform. She couldn't believe it. The same people who once ignored her now wanted her to share the stage. But with all that attention came new challenges. Managing the growing program wasn't easy. There were more students than instruments and sometimes not enough space for all of them. Lila found herself staying late every night, fixing old pianos, cleaning keyboards, organizing lessons, and writing letters to donors. Her assistant often told her, "You need to rest." She would just smile and say, "I'll rest when the music stops, and I don't think it will anytime soon." One rainy afternoon, while she was sweeping the stage, a familiar voice echoed from the doorway. "Still cleaning the stage yourself?" Lila looked up and froze for a moment. It was him, the man who had laughed at her years ago during that performance. He looked older now, softer around the edges, carrying a bouquet of flowers in one hand. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "I saw your story on TV. You've built something beautiful." Lila didn't know how to respond. There was no anger left in her, only quiet understanding. She simply smiled and said, "I just did what I could." He nodded slowly, placing the flowers on the piano. "You did more than that. You reminded people what real music feels like." He stayed for a while, watching the children practice. At one point, he turned to her and said, "I never told you this, but the night you played, you changed the way I see music." I was proud once, but I had forgotten what it meant to play with heart. Lila looked at him kindly. "Maybe we all lose it sometimes. The trick is finding our way back." He smiled, a little embarrassed, and said, "I guess I'm trying to find mine now." After he left, Lila stood at the piano, touching the flowers gently. Life had a strange way of circling back. The same person who once doubted her was now standing there, humbled and grateful. It made her realize something. People can change when they're reminded of what truly matters. Months passed and her music program continued to grow. A documentary filmmaker visited the town to capture their journey. He spent weeks following them, filming lessons, interviews, and the laughter between songs. When the short film was released online, it reached millions of views within days. People around the world were writing to Lila, sharing their own stories. Children from other countries, elderly people rediscovering their instruments, and even teachers who wanted to start their own programs. One message stood out. It came from a boy in a faraway city who wrote, "My mom works 3 jobs, but she always hums the song your students played on the radio. She says it gives her strength." Lila read that message over and over again, tears filling her eyes. She realized that her music wasn't just staying within her small hall anymore. It was reaching hearts across the world. One evening, after a long day, she walked through the empty hall again. The children had gone home. The instruments were neatly placed, and the only sound was the gentle creak of the floor under her feet. She sat down at the piano just like she always did when she needed peace. Her fingers touched the keys softly and she began to play, slow, steady, and filled with quiet emotion. The melody flowed like a memory, echoing through the empty space. Each note carried a story of laughter, tears, second chances, and the power of believing. Halfway through her song, her assistant walked in quietly and stood by the door, just listening. When she finished, he said softly, "You know, you've created something that will outlive all of us." Lila looked up, smiling. "I didn't plan any of this. It just happened one note at a time." He nodded. That's how the best things in life begin. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds parted just enough for a few stars to show. She sat there for a while, thinking about everything. The laughter that once mocked her, the applause that came later, and the silence that taught her the most. When she finally closed the piano lid, she whispered, "Thank you. Not to anyone in particular, Mano, but to life itself, for giving her a second chance to play." That night she wrote a new song. It wasn't grand or complicated, just a gentle melody about finding light in small moments. She decided to teach it to her students the next day. A week later, they performed it at a local park under the open sky. People gathered around, children sang softly, and the tune floated into the evening air. Some people cried without knowing why. Others smiled quietly, feeling something shift inside. The song spread like a whisper, from one listener to another. And before long, musicians online were covering it, naming it "One Note of Hope." Lila never claimed it as her own. She just said, "It belongs to everyone who ever felt small and chose to keep playing anyway." As the crowd clapped that evening, she looked at her students, proud, shining faces, full of dreams, and thought about how everything had started. One moment, one note, one decision to keep going when everyone else laughed. Now those small moments had built something no laughter could ever break. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, as the last group of children packed up their instruments for the day. Lila watched them from the doorway, her arms crossed gently, a soft smile on her face. The laughter that echoed across the hall was warm, filled with energy and hope. Every time she saw them like that, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She remembered how different things had been not too long ago, when the hall was silent and her music was just a whisper from the past. But now it was alive again. It was no longer her dream alone. It belonged to all of them. As the last child waved goodbye, Lila sat down at the piano. She ran her fingers lightly across the keys, the familiar smoothness grounding her. She played a few notes, not a song, just gentle sounds that filled the empty space. She had been teaching for years now, but something inside her said there was still more to do. She didn't know what it was yet, but she felt it, like a quiet knock on her heart. Later that evening, as she was locking up, her assistant walked in holding an envelope. "This came for you," he said. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter written in elegant handwriting. It was from the director of the National Music Conservatory, one of the most respected institutions in the country. "We've followed your work for some time," the letter read. "Your teaching has inspired countless young musicians. We would be honored if you and your students would perform at our annual Voices of Tomorrow concert in the capital." Lila read the letter twice, unable to believe it. It was an invitation to perform on one of the biggest stages in the nation, a place she had once dreamed of playing when she was young. Back then it had felt impossible, but now life was offering her another chance. When she shared the news the next day, the children erupted with excitement. The thought of performing in such a grand place thrilled them. Some jumped up and down, while others just stood in shock. Lila laughed softly and said, "All right, we have a lot of work to do then." For the next few weeks, the community center buzzed with activity. Rehearsals stretched long into the evenings. They practiced not just their music, but also how to stand, how to listen to one another, how to breathe together as one. It wasn't always easy. Some days the children grew frustrated, tired, or discouraged. But every time that happened, Lila reminded them gently, "Don't chase perfection, chase feeling." As the big day approached, she could sense both excitement and nervousness building. For many of the children, this was their first time leaving their small town. They had never seen a stage so grand or an audience so large. The morning of the concert, they traveled by bus through winding roads, laughter and chatter filling the air. Some practiced quietly on their small instruments, others stared out the window in awe of the city skyline as it appeared in the distance. When they arrived at the hall, the children gasped. It was enormous. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, the stage shone under bright lights, and rows upon rows of seats stretched out farther than they could imagine. Lila stood quietly for a moment, taking it all in. The last time she had stood on such a stage, she had been laughed at. Now she was returning, not alone but with dozens of young hearts beside her. As they prepared backstage, the noise of the audience grew louder. Among the crowd were musicians, critics, and teachers, people who had seen it all. But none of that mattered to Lila anymore. Before stepping onto the stage, she gathered her students in a circle. "Listen," she said softly, "this stage doesn't make you special. You already are. Don't play to impress them. Play to remind yourself who you are." The children nodded, holding hands for a moment before walking out together. The lights dimmed, the hall fell silent, and the curtain rose. Lila sat at the piano in the center, her students arranged around her with their instruments. For a moment there was complete stillness. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed one note. It was the same note she had played all those years ago, the note that had changed everything. The sound echoed softly across the hall, pure and steady. And then the children joined in. The music began slowly, growing in layers, a blend of piano, violins, and gentle rhythm. The melody was simple but powerful, the kind that reached straight into the heart. The audience sat completely still. Some leaned forward. Others just closed their eyes and listened. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that holds emotion too deep for words. Then, as if a spell had broken, the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Lila looked at her students. They were glowing, some crying, some laughing, all overwhelmed by what they had just experienced. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, the kind that only music can create. After the concert, reporters asked her how she felt. She smiled and said simply, "I came here once to prove something. Tonight I came to share something." The next morning, the newspapers carried her story again. Pictures of her and her students filled the pages, the headline reading, "From Mockery to Mastery, a Teacher's Journey That Moved a Nation." Messages flooded in once more, but this time, one stood out. It was from a man in another country, a head of an international music foundation. He had seen the performance online and wanted to collaborate with her to open similar music centers around the world. At first, Lila couldn't believe it, but after several meetings and visits, it became real. With his help and support from donors, her small-town program slowly grew into something global. Within a year, music centers inspired by her model opened in 3 other countries. Each center carried the same name, One Note of Hope. Every time she received photos from those places, children sitting at pianos, playing guitars or singing together, she smiled quietly, knowing the message had reached farther than she could ever travel herself. But despite all the success, she never left her little community hall. She always returned to the same piano, the same children, the same stage she once cleaned with her own hands. That was home. One evening, during the anniversary celebration of her first class, she sat at the piano again. The hall was filled with familiar faces, her students now older, some even teaching younger kids just like she had. As she looked at them, her eyes filled with emotion. She began to play the same melody that had started it all. The children joined in, their music blending perfectly with hers. When the song ended, the hall went quiet for a moment. Then one of her oldest students walked up to her holding a small plaque. It read, "For teaching us that one note, played with heart, can change everything." The audience stood and clapped. Lila tried to speak, but her voice broke. She could only smile through her tears. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, she stayed back in the empty hall. The air was still and the moonlight slipped through the window, casting soft shadows on the piano. She sat down one last time, placing her hands gently on the keys. She didn't play a full song this time, just that one note. The same single sound that had once filled a silent room and changed her life forever. It echoed softly, like a whisper of everything she had lived through. The pain, the laughter, the lessons, and the beauty. She closed her eyes and smiled. In that moment, she realized something simple but powerful. It was never about the applause. It was never about being the best. It was about the courage to play, even when someone laughed, even when the world didn't believe, because sometimes all it takes is one note to remind the world that beauty can come from anywhere, even from a broken heart that chose to play again. And as the sound faded into the quiet night, Lila whispered, "Thank you, music, for never leaving me." The next morning, when the children arrived, they found a small note left on the piano. It said only 3 words, "Keep playing always," and they did, every afternoon. The music continued. New faces, new laughter, new dreams. All born from one simple note that had once stunned a room and changed countless lives forever.